For decades, we have been told a simple story that the world is divided into civilizations, that the West and China are fundamentally different, and that conflict between them is inevitable. This idea is often called the clash of civilizations. But what if this story is wrong? What if China didn't rise by rejecting the West, but by learning from it, adapting it, and outplaying it? Today, we explore how China became Western to win and why this changes everything we think we know about global power. For decades, many people in the West have believed a simple and comforting idea that Western values are unique, superior, and fundamentally incompatible with the rest of the world. According to this belief, democracy, meritocracy, rational governance, and the rule of law are products of Western civilization alone. Ideas that naturally clash with cultures like China's. This worldview has a name: the clash of civilizations. In this narrative, the world is divided into cultural camps that are destined to compete, resist, and ultimately collide. The West represents openness and progress. China represents authoritarian tradition. Conflict, we are told, is inevitable. But history tells a much more complex and far more uncomfortable story. Long before Europe entered its modern age, China had already developed sophisticated systems of governance based on merit rather than birth. For over 1,000 years, Chinese emperors relied on civil service examinations to select officials. These exams tested knowledge, ethics, and administrative skill. In theory, a poor farmer's son could rise to high office if he demonstrated exceptional ability. This idea, that competence should outweigh aristocratic privilege, was revolutionary, and it existed in China centuries before similar principles were widely applied in Europe. When European thinkers later began advocating merit-based bureaucracy, standardized administration, and rational governance, they did not create these ideas in isolation. They observed other civilizations, including China, and adapted what they saw. Enlightenment-era scholars openly admired China's administrative efficiency. Some even argued that China's governance was more rational than Europe's feudal systems. The West did not invent modern governance from nothing. It refined ideas through observation, experimentation, and borrowing. The clash narrative ignores this shared intellectual history. It assumes civilizations are sealed containers, incapable of learning from one another. But power has never grown that way. Throughout history, the most successful societies were not the most isolated. They were the most adaptive. They studied rivals, absorbed useful ideas, and discarded what no longer worked. Rome borrowed from Greece. Europe borrowed from the Islamic world. Japan borrowed from the West. China was never an exception. By framing China and the West as opposites locked in cultural combat, the clash myth oversimplifies reality. It replaces analysis with ideology. It turns strategic competition into moral theater. And most dangerously, it blinds policymakers to how power actually evolves. Civilizations do not rise by rejecting outside influence. They rise by mastering it. The real story is not about an unavoidable clash. It is about learning, adaptation, and strategic intelligence. And once we understand that, the rise of China begins to look far less mysterious and far more deliberate. By the 19th century, China faced a brutal awakening. After centuries of relative stability and dominance in East Asia, it encountered Western powers armed with industrial technology, modern militaries, and global trade networks. The result was humiliation. China suffered military defeats, economic exploitation, and colonial pressure. Ports were forced open. Sovereignty was compromised. National confidence collapsed. Many civilizations, when faced with such trauma, retreat into denial. They blame outsiders, glorify the past, and resist change. China could have chosen that path. Instead, it chose something far more dangerous and far more effective. China studied its enemies. Chinese reformers, scholars, and later revolutionaries examined Western systems with ruthless honesty. They asked difficult questions. Why were Western armies stronger? Why were their economies more productive? Why were their institutions more resilient? The answers led to systematic analysis. China examined Western education systems, especially their emphasis on science, engineering, and technical training. It studied industrial organization, how factories were managed, how supply chains functioned, how productivity was scaled. It analyzed scientific research models that connected universities, industry, and the state. It also studied capitalism, not as an ideology, but as a tool. Efficiency, incentives, Capital accumulation and innovation were dissected carefully. Western state institutions were examined for their strengths and weaknesses. But here is the critical distinction. China did not copy blindly. Unlike some countries that attempted to import Western systems wholesale, China treated foreign ideas as raw material, not finished products. Each concept was filtered through local conditions, history, and political priorities. Markets were introduced, but without surrendering political control. Private enterprise was encouraged, but strategic sectors remained under state guidance. Technology was welcomed, but ideology was not allowed to dominate national decision-making. This was not inconsistency, it was design. China understood that copying the West entirely would recreate Western problems: political paralysis, ideological polarization, and short-termism. Instead, it sought balance. Western tools, Chinese control. This approach required patience, discipline, and a long-term vision. It demanded the ability to delay gratification, something many modern systems struggle to do. Far from being a sign of weakness, this selective learning was an expression of strategic confidence. China was not trying to become Western, it was trying to become stronger. And strength, in the modern world, comes from mastering systems, not worshipping them. When China joined global institutions built by the West, many Western leaders believed they were witnessing the beginning of China's transformation. Membership in the World Trade Organization, integration into global supply chains, participation in international finance. The assumption was clear: exposure would lead to convergence. China would liberalize politically. It would adopt Western norms. It would become dependent on the very systems that created Western dominance. Instead, something unexpected happened. China used these systems not to surrender, but to scale. By integrating into global supply chains, China became the world's manufacturing hub. It absorbed foreign investment, technology, and expertise at unprecedented speed. Capital accumulation fueled infrastructure, education, and industrial upgrading. Millions were trained. Entire industries were built from scratch. Technological capacity expanded year after year. While Western corporations optimized for quarterly earnings, China optimized for national capability. While investors sought immediate returns, Chinese planners focused on decades-long horizons. This difference mattered. The West treated globalization as an end in itself. China treated it as a phase. International finance became a tool for capital access, not dependency. Trade became a mechanism for learning, not submission. Global rules were followed closely, sometimes more closely than Western nations themselves, while domestic strategy remained firmly in Chinese hands. The system was not rejected, it was mastered, and slowly, the balance shifted. Manufacturing dominance turned into technological ambition. Learning turned into innovation. Participation turned into leverage. China did not break the system. It played it better. Western policymakers expected a familiar pattern. Economic modernization would lead to political liberalization. Integration would produce ideological alignment. Dependence would ensure compliance. None of that happened. China became modern without becoming Western in identity, efficient without adopting liberal democracy, global without becoming submissive. This outcome contradicts decades of assumptions. The confusion comes from a deeply held belief that modernization has only one path, that economic development naturally produces Western-style politics, that efficiency requires ideological openness. China shattered that model. It demonstrated that competence does not require imitation, that modernity does not demand uniformity, that power can be built through discipline, coordination, and long-term planning. The real shock is not China's difference, it is China's effectiveness. Western systems struggle with internal division, short-term incentives, and institutional paralysis. China, whatever its flaws, executes policy at scale with remarkable consistency. This forces an uncomfortable realization. The West's advantage was never guaranteed by values alone. It was built through strategy, adaptation, and learning. And now, those same skills are being used by others. For decades, we have been conditioned to view the world through the lens of confrontation. We are told that civilizations are static, that they are defined by unchangeable values, and that conflicts between them are inevitable. This mindset creates a false dichotomy: the West versus the rest, democracy versus authoritarianism, liberalism versus tradition. But the rise of China challenges this notion at its core. The biggest lesson we can take from China's story is that civilizations are not locked in permanent opposition. They can learn from each other. They can absorb ideas, adapt strategies, and evolve in ways that surprise even the most confident observers. China's ascent teaches us that power does not belong to those who merely proclaim their ideals or enforce their identity. Power belongs to those who combine vision with discipline, who are patient and methodical, and who continuously learn from their environment. China's leaders understood early on that ideology alone does not guarantee success. They realized that the tools of the West, technology, education systems, industrial models, global trade mechanisms, are not threats if they could be studied, adapted, and integrated. They approached these tools not with blind imitation, but with strategic intelligence. They asked a simple question: how can we use what exists to serve our long-term goals without sacrificing our identity? This approach highlights a critical misunderstanding in global politics. The West often assumed that exposing China to Western systems would automatically liberalize it, make it politically similar, or force it to conform to Western expectations. Yet China demonstrated that modernization does not require Westernization. You can adopt the efficiency of markets without surrendering political control. You can embrace science and technology without adopting the ideology that historically accompanied them in the West. You can participate in global institutions without losing sovereignty. In other words, learning does not equal assimilation. Strategic adaptation is not the same as cultural erasure. The West's confusion today is rooted in this very misinterpretation. Policymakers expected China to mirror Western values once it became technologically advanced and economically powerful. When that didn't happen, it seemed to defy logic. But the truth is simpler. China's success comes not from rejecting the West or from copying it, but from outlearning it. Chinese strategists focused on long-term national objectives rather than short-term political gains or immediate profits. Their patience, their methodical approach, and their emphasis on human capital development created a system that is resilient, self-reinforcing, and increasingly influential. Perhaps the most important takeaway is that civilizations are not monolithic entities. They are collections of people, institutions, ideas, and practices, all capable of change. The myth that civilizations are locked in an eternal clash blinds us to the real drivers of power, adaptability, learning, and strategic foresight. Those who succeed in the 21st century are not necessarily those who claim moral superiority or cultural dominance. They are those who can observe, understand, and integrate the best ideas from anywhere in the world, while maintaining cohesion and direction at home. China's rise also redefines our understanding of competition. It is not just about economics or military power. It is about the intellectual discipline to study your rivals, identify what works, and implement it efficiently. It is about building systems that multiply your capacity over decades, rather than chasing immediate recognition. In this sense, China's story is less about ideology and more about competence. It is a lesson in the practical application of knowledge, in the patient accumulation of resources, and in the relentless pursuit of national objectives. Ultimately, the real lesson for the world is clear. Strategic intelligence beats rhetorical power. Countries and civilizations that cling rigidly to the idea that values alone determine success are at risk of falling behind. The future belongs to those who can learn the fastest, plan the longest, and adapt the smartest. China's example shows that strategic foresight, disciplined execution, and the ability to learn from others are far more decisive than moral or cultural claims. It is not a story of East versus West, but of smart strategy versus static thinking. The implications are profound. If we continue to see global politics as a clash of civilizations, we will miss the subtle but decisive forces shaping the modern world. Instead, we should focus on learning, adaptation, and strategic planning. We should ask ourselves, which nations or organizations are capable of evolving in the face of new challenges? Which leaders are willing to study, innovate, and implement long-term strategies rather than react impulsively? The answers will determine not only economic and political power, but also the ability to thrive in an increasingly complex global system. China's rise reminds us that intelligence, not ideology, is the currency of power. The lesson is universal. Any civilization that refuses to learn from others, that prioritizes pride over pragmatism, or that underestimates the importance of strategic adaptation risks stagnation. Conversely, those willing to observe, understand, and integrate the best practices without losing their core identity will shape the future. This is the enduring insight of our time. The real world is won not through cultural confrontation, but through the careful, calculated, and competent application of knowledge. In conclusion, the story of China's ascent challenges the myths we have long believed about civilizations. It teaches us that learning across cultural and ideological boundaries is not only possible, but essential for national success. The lesson is simple, yet profound. In a world defined less by inherent clashes and more by adaptability, competence, and strategic intelligence, the winners will be those who learn the fastest, plan the longest, and act the smartest. If we understand this, we can see the world not as a battlefield of civilizations, but as a dynamic arena where knowledge, strategy, and foresight determine outcomes.